All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into Sarah Churchwell's Careless People, murder, mayhem, and the invention of the Great Gatsby.
Ooh, this one looks fascinating. A real-life murder mystery mixed with literary history. I'm in.
You and me both. And our listener who sent this our way is particularly intrigued by the connections between Fitzgerald's masterpiece and the Hall Mills murder case that gripped the nation back in 1922.
Right, the Jazz Age, full of those roaring parties, flapper dresses, and apparently a scandalous murder case. It's like something straight out of a Fitzgerald novel.
Exactly, and that's what we're here to unpack. How did these seemingly separate narratives, the fictional world of the Great Gatsby and the very real, very brutal Hall Mills murder, actually intertwine? How do they reflect a darker side of the Jazz Age, a side that maybe we don't always see in those glamorous photographs and Hollywood portrayals?
And what's even more intriguing is that Fitzgerald was actually drafting Gatsby during that same summer of 1922, the same time this murder case was unfolding, dominating the headlines.
Right, and as we'll see, this wasn't just a coincidence. Fitzgerald and Zelda were living the high life on Long Island, rubbing shoulders with the very people who would inspire his characters.
Living the high life while a real-life murder mystery was unfolding practically on their doorstep. You couldn't make this stuff up.
You really couldn't. Now let's start with the murder itself. A 1931 history called it the murder of the decade, and Churchwell quotes this to highlight just how much it captured the public's imagination. Why? Well, it had everything. A gruesome crime, drama, wealth, respectability, a sexual element, and crucially, it happened close to the New York press hub. Talk about a recipe for sensationalism.
It's the kind of story that newspapers just ate up. And the details themselves were almost theatrical, adding to the intrigue. I mean, the bodies were found on a lover's lane, DeRussey's Lane, under a crabapple tree, no less. And then you have these larger-than-life characters involved. The pig woman, Jane Gibson with her mule, Willie Stevens, the odd job man, and all the whispers and gossip among the members of the choir. You can almost picture the reporters racing to get the latest scoop, every detail more scandalous than the last.
So while this real-life drama was unfolding, Fitzgerald and Zelda were living their own glamorous, albeit sometimes tumultuous, lives on Long Island. They were right near the famed Gold Coast, which, as we know, becomes such a central setting in The Great Gatsby. What was their world like in that summer and autumn of 1922?
It was a world of parties, champagne, and the constant pursuit of pleasure. A world that Fitzgerald was both drawn to and, as we'll see, somewhat critical of. They were definitely part of that social whirl. But Fitzgerald was also trying to work on his novel, albeit sporadically, alongside other writing commitments.
Trying to balance the demands of art and the allure of the high life, it's a tension that we see play out in Gatsby as well.
Definitely. It's like he was living in two worlds at once, the world of his imagination, where he was crafting this great American novel, and the very real world of the Jazz Age, with all its excesses and contradictions. And Churchwell meticulously pieces together their lives during this period using diary entries, letters, and contemporary accounts. It's fascinating to see how it all comes together.
It's fascinating to see how much of their own experiences, their own observations of this world, seeped into Fitzgerald's writing. And that brings us back to the murder. We mentioned New Brunswick's proximity to Princeton Fitzgerald's alma mater. Why is that significant?
It wasn't just that New Brunswick was geographically close to Princeton. Princeton was a place Fitzgerald and Zelda still visited regularly for football games, for cocktail parties. So this murder, this scandal, was happening in a place that was part of their social sphere.
It wasn't just a random news story happening somewhere far away. It was something that was almost uncomfortably close to home.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the details of the murder itself were striking, gruesome even. The discovery of the bodies, the way they were arranged, it was almost staged like a morbid tableau. Churchwell really digs into the way the press covered the case, playing up the sensational aspects, the love letters, the calling card propped against his shoe, all of it. It's like they were creating a narrative, turning this tragedy into a spectacle.
So you have the reality of this brutal murder juxtaposed with this almost theatrical presentation of it in the press. It's like reality itself was becoming distorted.
And it's hard not to wonder if that distortion, that blurring of the lines between fact and fiction, had an impact on Fitzgerald's writing. While all this was happening, Fitzgerald and Zelda were taking a taxi to the Plaza Hotel, their favorite in New York.
And the Plaza, Zelda famously called it an etched hotel, dainty and subdued, hinting that it wasn't really their style. What was New York City like back then, in 1922?
Imagine a city that was still sparkling with a sense of newness. Churchwell paints his picture of a New York that was less dense, less overwhelming. Scott described it as having all the iridescence of the beginning of the world, And Zelda later wrote that New York was more full of reflections than of itself.
It was a city full of possibility, a city on the rise, much like the Fitzgeralds themselves. They saw themselves as being at the forefront of this new era, this greatest, gaudiest spree in history, as Fitzgerald described it.
They were riding the wave of the jazz age, feeling that energy and excitement. And to really capture that spirit, Churchwell even includes a list of new words that were coined between 1918 and 1923. Words like cool, teenage, debunk, mass media feedback, and ritzy.
It's like looking through a linguistic time capsule, seeing how language itself was changing to reflect this new world. And of course, fashion was also evolving. Churchwell even corrects some common misconceptions about what people were wearing back then.
Yeah, you know that classic image of the flapper with the super short hemlines? Well, in 1922, hemlines were actually getting longer. The New York Times even ran a feature on it.
So the fashion wasn't quite as uniformly flamboyant as we might think. It was a bit more nuanced.
Exactly. And Fitzgerald was very much attuned to these nuances, to the changing social landscape. And he himself was becoming a cultural icon, the voice of this jazzing young America, as the press called it.
He was almost typecast as the chronicler of this new generation, wasn't he? The spokesman of the younger generation, someone who understood the anxieties and aspirations of this rapidly changing world.
But there were also critics who felt that Fitzgerald's work lacked depth, that he wasn't really inventing anything, just reflecting his own experiences back at the reader. It's like they were accusing him of being a glorified gossip columnist.
But maybe that was part of his genius, his ability to capture the zeitgeist, to make those personal experiences resonate on a broader level.
Right, it's that blurring of the lines between life and art that makes Fitzgerald so fascinating. It's like Nick Carraway's observation in Gatsby, about Gatsby springing from his own Platonic conception of himself. And that idea of self-invention, needing a model, really applies to the Fitzgeralds themselves.
There's this sense that they were both creating their own identities, playing roles, and observing how those roles were perceived by others.
They were both participating in the performance and documenting it at the same time, almost like they were plagiarizing their existence, as one critic put it.
And all this while this very real murder mystery was playing out in the background, a reminder that even in the midst of this glamorous world, there was a darker reality lurking beneath the surface.
A reality that the authorities seemed completely unprepared to deal with. Because despite all the headlines and public outcry, the Hall Mills investigation was going nowhere. Churchwell describes this chaotic crime scene where reporters were practically stepping over each other, touching evidence, scattering those love letters even further.
Yeah.
And the police, well, let's just say they weren't exactly following proper procedures. Fingerprints weren't taken, the crime scene wasn't properly secured. It was a mess.
Talk about a missed opportunity. It's almost hard to believe that a murder investigation of this magnitude could be handled so poorly.
It really speaks to the incompetence or perhaps even the corruption of the local authorities. And meanwhile, Long Island itself was becoming a symbol of this new American wealth, this ostentatious display of affluence.
Right, the Gold Coast, as it was called, a playground for those who had made their fortunes in the Gilded Age. What was it about this place that so captivated Fitzgerald?
It was more than just the wealth itself. It was the way that wealth was being used to create these grand illusions, these factual imitations of old world aristocracy, as Churchwell puts it. They were building these massive estates, almost trying to recreate European royalty on American soil. It was a symbol of aspiration, but also of, as Churchwell says, mendacious traditions.
This idea of a fabricated history, a constructed identity, it echoes Gatsby's own story, doesn't it? The way he tries to reinvent himself, to create this image of wealth and sophistication, even though it's all built on a foundation of lies.
Absolutely. Fitzgerald was keenly observing this world, studying the people who inhabited it, trying to understand their motivations, their anxieties. Churchwell even mentions a 1926 New Yorker profile that highlights Fitzgerald's research into the lives of big business figures like Harriman and Morgan. He was fascinated by how these fortunes were made, by the often ruthless tactics employed. He was particularly interested in the gospel of wealth that seemed to permeate the era.
This idea that wealth was a sign of moral virtue, that it excused any number of sins.
Exactly. And Fitzgerald saw through that. He understood that this wealth was often built on exploitation, on dishonesty. He even referred to those Gilded Age tycoons as glorified crooks. He had this deep-seated distrust of the leisure class, this smoldering hatred of a peasant, as he put it, always wondering where the money really came from.
So you have this interesting dynamic where Fitzgerald is both embedded in this world of wealth and privilege, yet also critical of it. He's observing it from the inside, but he's not entirely seduced by it.
And that tension, that duality is what makes his writing so compelling. Churchwell also gives us a glimpse into Fitzgerald's social world during this time, mentioning Burton Rascoe.
Burton Masco, remind me, who was he again?
Oh, he was this literary columnist and quite the gossip, loved to name drop and be in the know. On September 17th, 1922, his column reflected on the state of American literature. But that same night, Fitzgerald called him up late, wanted to go out and party with Zelda and their friends. But Rascoe, already in bed, declined.
He chose sleep over a night out with the Fitzgeralds. Bold move.
It shows you just how much energy Fitzgerald had, how much he craved that constant social stimulation. And it was around this time that they made a pretty significant move, relocating to Great Neck.
Great Neck. Why there, specifically?
Churchwell suggests it was a deliberate decision. They wanted to be closer to the millionaires on Long Island's North Shore, to really immerse themselves in that world. They even might have thrown a party right after arriving to introduce themselves to their new neighbors.
Talk about making a grand entrance. And what was Great Neck like in 1922? What kind of atmosphere did they find themselves in?
It was a booming town, a mix of ambition, talent, and of course, a lot of partying. You can even see the Manhattan skyscrapers in the distance, a constant reminder of the wealth and opportunity that was drawing people to the area. Churchwell describes this anecdote of them arriving with Dos Passos and mocking this real estate agent while looking at these ritzy mansions. And then they ended up deciding to go visit Ring Lardner, a writer they admired.
Ring Lardner. Now, he's an interesting character. He was known for his sharp wit and his satirical take on American life.
Exactly. And he and Fitzgerald became fast friends, bonding over their shared sense of humor and their somewhat cynical view of the world around them. Lardner even called Great Neck Wonder City, a not-so-subtle dig at the pretensions of the place.
Meanwhile, the Hall Mills investigation was still dragging on, and a shocking detail emerges. No autopsies were initially performed on the victims.
It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? They only examined the bodies later when it became clear that there were some serious oversights in the initial investigation. It turns out that the bullet trajectory ruled out any murder-suicide scenario, despite earlier speculation.
So the initial incompetence really hindered the investigation from the get-go, and Fitzgerald, despite being surrounded by this world of parties and extravagance, had a rather complex relationship with it all.
Churchwell quotes him saying, "Parties are a form of suicide. I love them, but the old Catholic in me secretly disapproves."
A bit of Catholic guilt mixed with that jazz age exuberance. He even admitted to feeling socially anxious, confessing that he was always trying to live up to the men who had all the money and social advantages. That sense of being an outsider, of striving to belong, definitely comes through in his writing.
And in his early ideas for Gatsby, particularly in his Notes for Man's Hope, that feeling of social exclusion is particularly evident in the character of Myrtle Wilson.
Right, Myrtle, with her love nest in Washington Heights, a place that Fitzgerald associated with his own fears of failure. Even the details, he includes the lavender taxi she takes, the magazine Town Tattle she's reading, point to this desire to appear more sophisticated, more affluent than she really is.
It's like she's trying to buy her way into a world that doesn't really want her, a world that's built on illusions.
And that's a theme that runs through Gatsby as well. Those lavish parties, the champagne, the beautiful people, it's all very seductive, but it's also ultimately empty. There's this sense of decay, of moral corruption lurking beneath the surface. And Churchwell emphasizes how Fitzgerald uses sensory details, the food, the music, the lights, the colors, to create this almost dreamlike atmosphere in the novel. But it's a dream that's ultimately unsustainable, a world built on a foundation of lies and deception.
Exactly. And just as Fitzgerald was working on these ideas, the real-life Hall Mills investigation took a dramatic turn. On October 1st, 1922, the same day Fitzgerald was reading about himself in the New York Times, headlines announced that the state was taking over the case.
They finally realized they needed to bring in the big guns, so to speak.
Right. The local authorities had botched the investigation so badly that they had no choice. And this was happening at a time when comparisons between the excesses of the Jazz Age and historical decadence were becoming commonplace.
People were starting to see parallels between the fall of Rome and the potential downfall of American society.
And New York City, in particular, was being seen as a symbol of that decadence, a modern Babylon, as some called it. Zelda even wrote that they were partying like ancient Rome and Nineveh.
So there was this sense of living on borrowed time, of pushing the limits of morality and social norms. And amidst all this, Fitzgerald was forging a close friendship with Ring Lardner in Great Neck.
Yeah, they really hit it off. They shared this sharp wit, this ability to see through the hypocrisy and pretense of the world around them. Lardner was a bit older, a bit more cynical, but they found common ground in their love of language and their somewhat jaded view of humanity. They'd hang out, trade jokes, and complain about their neighbors in Wonder City, as Lardner called Great Neck.
It's amazing that even in a place like Great Neck, full of those ritzy mansions and over-the-top parties, they found a way to connect on a more genuine level through their shared love of writing.
They were both observers, trying to make sense of this crazy world around them. And it's interesting how the word party itself started to take on a different meaning during this time, a more illicit connotation.
Right, it wasn't just about innocent fun anymore. It was about illegal alcohol, risky behavior, and pushing boundaries. It was about a kind of reckless abandon that could have dangerous consequences.
Churchwell points out that by that summer, the word party had become synonymous with these gatherings fueled by bootleg liquor. And the New York Times even ran an editorial criticizing this new definition, even saying that Fitzgerald's own novel, The Beautiful and Damned, accurately depicted this world and should have been called The Boozeful and Damned.
So once again, we see how Fitzgerald's writing was reflecting and perhaps even shaping the social landscape. Another key figure in Great Neck was Herbert Bayard Swope, who would become a major inspiration for the character of Gatsby.
Swope was this larger-than-life figure, the editor of the New York World, and he was known for throwing these legendary parties at his house. They were the talk of the town, attracting everyone from writers to politicians to, well, people connected to murder.
He sounds like quite the character, and he was actually good friends with the notorious gambler Arnold Rothstein, who would later inspire Meyer Wolfsham in Gatsby.
Yeah, their worlds were definitely intertwined. And Swope himself played a role in exposing corruption in the New York City Police Department, which led to the execution of a police officer who was involved in the murder of another gambler associated with Rothstein. It's like you can't separate these worlds of journalism, wealth, and crime.
They were all connected, all part of the same tapestry of the Jazz Age, and the Fitzgeralds were right in the middle of it all.
They were frequent guests at Swope's parties, at least at first. There's even the story that Zelda got them banned after some scandalous behavior at one of the gatherings.
Sounds about right. What was the atmosphere like at these parties? What was it about them that so captivated Fitzgerald?
Picture this: top-notch bootleg whiskey, picnics on the lawn, afternoon naps, and then, as the evening wore on, a live band and dancing. There's even a saying that you could always get a steak at Swope's at 4 in the morning. These parties were non-stop, a constant stream of stimulation and excess.
It's like they were trying to squeeze every drop of pleasure out of every moment. But while the Fitzgeralds were enjoying this world, the public was getting increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in the Hall Mills case.
Right. The public anger was palpable. People felt like the authorities were dragging their feet, maybe even covering something up. There were even rumors that the Ku Klux Klan was involved.
It was a time of great social upheaval. The Klan was experiencing a resurgence, and racial tensions were high.
And in the midst of all this, you have these financial scandals rocking the nation. Churchwell mentions the Fuller and McGee stock fraud case, which involves missing evidence, bribed witnesses, and even whispers of Arnold Rothstein's involvement.
It's like everyone was trying to get ahead, no matter the cost. There was this sense that the old rules didn't apply anymore, that morality was fluid.
And that's what Fitzgerald was trying to capture in his writing, that feeling of moral ambiguity, that sense that the American dream was becoming corrupted. And it's interesting how even the seemingly mundane details of everyday life, like taking a taxi, could be connected to the criminal underworld.
Right. Churchwell talks about Larry Fay, who built his entire taxi empire on profits from bootlegging. And he even used the swastika as a good luck charm before it became associated with Nazi Germany.
It's a reminder of how much the world was changing, how quickly symbols and meanings could shift. And while all this was going on, the literary world was closely following the Hall Mills case, trying to make sense of it all.
Churchwell describes this gathering at the Algonquin, where writers like Rasco and Fitzgerald were discussing the latest developments in the case. It's like the murder had become this shared cultural obsession.
It was the talk of the town, fodder for gossip and speculation. And Churchwell introduces this idea of a preposterous cycle to describe how all these seemingly disparate elements, the parties, the violence, the financial scandals, the moral ambiguities, were all somehow connected. It's like they were all feeding off each other, creating this sense of chaos and uncertainty.
It was a world where the lines between truth and fiction were becoming increasingly blurred, and the Algonquin Round Table, with its cast of witty writers and sharp-tongued critics, was right at the center of it all.
They were the cultural elite, the ones who were shaping the conversation, and they were fascinated by the Hall Mills case, by the way it exposed the cracks in the facade of American society. And this was also the year that T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland was published, a poem that captured the sense of fragmentation and disillusionment of the post-war era.
So there was this sense of a cultural shift taking place, a questioning of old values and a search for new meaning. And Fitzgerald was right there in the thick of it, trying to find his own voice amidst all the noise. He even looked to literary giants like Conrad for inspiration.
Churchwell quotes Conrad on the artist's role in shining the light of magic suggestiveness on language. And Fitzgerald really took that to heart. He wanted to create something that was both beautiful and meaningful, something that would capture the essence of his time. And he even wrote this short story, Absolution, which was originally a backstory for Gatsby, that explores these themes of disillusionment and the search for beauty.
And even small details in Fitzgerald's notes, like a cryptic reference to Mary, offer clues into his creative process.
Churchwell speculates that this Mary could be a reference to the actress Mary Hay, who was a huge star at the time. And there was even this article in the Tribune that contrasted Hay with a suffragist of the same name, highlighting the tension between traditional notions of femininity and the changing roles of women in society.
It was a time of great change for women. The first woman senator was sworn in, albeit only for a day, and the debate over women's rights was raging.
And Fitzgerald was very aware of these social shifts. He was exploring them in his writing, trying to understand what it all meant. And meanwhile, he was becoming increasingly aware of his own literary reputation, his own fame.
He was being hailed as a genius, a voice of his generation. But he was also starting to feel the pressure of that fame, the expectations that came with it.
And he had this nagging sense that maybe he wasn't living up to his own potential, that maybe he was more interested in the parties and the glamour than in the hard work of writing.
It's like he was caught between two worlds, the world of the artist and the world of the celebrity.
And he was struggling to reconcile the two. And his use of language in Gatsby is particularly interesting. He doesn't spell everything out for the reader. He leaves a lot to the imagination. He uses suggestion, implication, and that creates a much more powerful, more resonant effect.
Right. It's like he's inviting the reader to become a co-creator, to fill in the blanks with their own experiences and interpretations.
And that's one of the things that makes Gatsby such an enduring work of art. It speaks to each reader in a different way, depending on their own perspective. And back in the real world, the Hall Mills case was still dominating the headlines. And it was the women involved, the wives, the mistresses, the witnesses, whose stories were really shaping the narrative.
It's like they were the ones who held the key to understanding the case, the ones who could shed light on the motivations and relationships that led to the murders.
And Churchwell points out how even the descriptions of their homes became symbolic of their social standing, their aspirations, their place in the world.
The homes as metaphors for the women themselves.
Exactly. And this was happening against a backdrop of social and political upheaval, of changing gender roles, of racial tension, of economic uncertainty. It was a world in flux, a world that was both exciting and terrifying.
And Fitzgerald was trying to capture all of that in his writing. He was trying to make sense of it, to find meaning in the chaos. He even revisited the theme of social climbing and disillusionment in his short story, One of My Most Brilliant Evenings, which echoes some of the themes in Gatsby.
And the contrasting settings of West Egg and East Egg in Gatsby can also be seen as a reflection of these social divisions. West Egg, with its raw energy and nouveau riche inhabitants, represents the dynamism and ambition of the Jazz Age, while East Egg, with its old money and established families, symbolizes the more traditional, more conservative side of American society.
And Daisy, of course, is caught between those two worlds. She's drawn to Gatsby's passion and energy, but she's also tethered to the security and social status of Tom Buchanan.
It's a classic love triangle, but it's also a metaphor for the larger conflict between tradition and modernity, between the past and the future. And even the music that Fitzgerald chooses for his novel reflects this tension. He mentions this neat, sad little waltz called 3 o'clock in the morning, playing at Gatsby's party, a song that captures that feeling of disillusionment that lurks beneath the surface of all the revelry.
It's like a musical foreshadowing of the tragedy to come. And the concept of the unreliable narrator adds another layer of complexity to both Gatsby and the real-life accounts of the Hall Mills case.
Churchwell talks about how even the journalists and biographers of the time weren't always trustworthy, that they often embellished stories, misquoted sources, and shaped the narrative to fit their own agendas.
It's like we're being reminded that there's always more than one side to every story, that truth is often subjective.
And that's something that Fitzgerald was very aware of. He was playing with these ideas of perception and reality in Gatsby, forcing the reader to question what they're seeing, what they're being told. And speaking of unreliable narrators, the Hall Mills trial finally reached its climax, with Mrs. Gibson taking the stand.
The pig woman herself, the one who claimed to have witnessed the murders.
Her testimony was the prosecution's big hope. But it quickly became clear that her story was full of holes, full of inconsistencies. And the jury, after deliberating for just a few hours, returned with a verdict of not guilty.
So justice wasn't served, at least not in the eyes of the law. But perhaps there was a kind of poetic justice in the way that Mrs. Gibson's own fabrications ultimately led to her downfall.
And the aftermath of Gatsby's parties in the novel also carries this sense of emptiness, of disillusionment. There's this description of the desolate path of debris after one of his lavish gatherings, which symbolizes the waste and decay that lie at the heart of this world.
It's like a visual metaphor for the moral corruption that's been festering beneath the surface all along.
And the critics of the time definitely picked up on this. One review even called it a gargantuan drinking party, highlighting the excess and the moral ambiguity.
It's like Fitzgerald was holding a mirror up to society, showing them the ugly truth behind the glamour.
And he wasn't afraid to implicate himself in that critique. He knew that he was part of that world, that he was complicit in its excesses. He wasn't just observing it, he was living it.
And that honesty, that willingness to confront the darkness is what makes his work so powerful.
Absolutely. And Churchwell does a brilliant job of connecting the dots between Fitzgerald's life, his writing, and the social and cultural landscape of the Jazz Age.
She shows us how these seemingly disparate threads are all woven together into a rich tapestry, a tapestry that reveals both the beauty and the ugliness of that era.
And in doing so, she helps us to understand the Great Gatsby on a deeper level, to see it not just as a love story or a tragedy, but as a reflection of the American dream itself, with all its complexities and contradictions.
It's a story about aspiration and disillusionment, about the pursuit of wealth and the hollowness of materialism, about the allure of the past and the impossibility of recapturing it. And it's a story that continues to resonate with us today because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our desire for connection, our longing for something more, and our capacity for both great love and great cruelty.
And it's a story that's deeply rooted in its time and place, in the specific details of the Jazz Age, in the real-life events that shaped Fitzgerald's imagination. By exploring those connections, Churchwell helps us to see Gatsby in a new light, to appreciate its artistry even more, and to understand its enduring power. Churchwell even delves into Fitzgerald's ledgers to reveal just how much partying was going on.
Oh, the Fitzgerald's famous ledgers. Always a treasure trove of information and maybe a few scandalous tidbits. What kind of entries are we talking about?
Well, for December 1922, Fitzgerald just wrote lots of parties and then many parties. It's almost like the memories were blurring together into this steady silvered roar, as he described it later. And Zelda wrote that these weeks-long revels were relentless and that everything was done to a catastrophic finale, with hangovers lasting for days.
It sounds like a whirlwind of excess and ultimately exhaustion. How did the Fitzgeralds themselves navigate the dynamics of these parties? Were they participants or observers, or a bit of both?
That's a great question, and one that Churchwell explores in detail. It seems Gatsby's innocent ostentation, where he prefers to observe the effects of his lavish parties rather than actively participate in them, might be more reflective of Scott, while Zelda was often the center of attention, engaging in what some might call exhibitionism. George Jean Nathan even recounts stories of Zelda's antics, like dancing on tables at the Algonquin and throwing herself onto the railroad tracks at Grand Central Station.
These anecdotes definitely paint a picture of Zelda as someone who embraced the spotlight, perhaps even recklessly at times. Did any contemporary observers pick up on this difference between Scott and Zelda, and how they navigated their social world?
Yes. Ernest Boyd, a writer at the time, described them as characters straight out of Fitzgerald's own fiction. He called Zelda the blonde philosopher of the Jazz Age and the blonde flapper, a telling observation given the evolving fashion trends we discussed earlier. He noted how Fitzgerald could seamlessly blend intellectual discussions with wild partying and was surprisingly serious about topics like marital fidelity, which suggests a more thoughtful side beneath the surface of revelry.
It sounds like Boyd was able to capture the complexities of their personalities, the contradictions that made them so fascinating. Did he ever describe a typical night out with the Fitzgeralds?
Oh, absolutely. One particular night Boyd describes as pure jazz-age gold. They started with dinner while listening to George Gershwin play, fueled by bootleg liquor.
Yeah.
Then they hopped into a Rolls-Royce not Gatsby's, but still symbolic of the era's extravagance for a wild ride up Broadway, stopping at various cabarets. At one point, Zelda inexplicably started signing autographs. Boyd even mentions Fitzgerald's rather erratic driving, which foreshadows the tragic car accident in Gatsby. It sounds like a night that could have easily inspired one of Fitzgerald's short stories.
Speaking of Gatsby, it's interesting how the novel seamlessly transitions into a murder mystery in Chapter 7.
Right. Nick even imagines the butler speaking like a character from a detective novel. And it's Daisy's accidental confession of her love for Gatsby that sets the chain of events in motion, leading to the fateful drive into New York City.
And that indefinable expression that Nick notices on Gatsby's face, which he later recognizes as looking like a killer, definitely adds to the suspense. It's like a subtle foreshadowing of the violence to come.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that sense of impending doom only intensifies when they stop at Wilson's garage. You have the setting itself, the desolate valley of ashes, a stark contrast to the glittering world of West Egg. And then there's Wilson himself, looking pale and sickly, muttering about being wised up to something funny.
He suspects that Myrtle is having an affair, but he doesn't know the full extent of her betrayal. And of course, this is all happening under the watchful eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, the billboard looming over the scene.
Right. Those giant, disembodied eyes staring down at them, judging them. And then you have Myrtle peering out from the window, her jealous gaze fixed on Jordan, whom she mistakes for Daisy.
There's this tension, this sense of hidden desires and simmering resentment.
And Nick even mentions that the curiously familiar expression in Myrtle's eyes might resonate with those following the Hall Mills case, further blurring the lines between fiction and reality. It's like Fitzgerald is inviting us to consider the parallels between these two worlds, to see how the anxieties and desires of the Jazz Age could lead to both tragedy and transgression.
Around the same time, Fitzgerald was grappling with his own creative frustrations. He had this lost play, The Vegetable, and the film version of The Beautiful and Damned opened, but he was dissatisfied with the dust jacket illustration.
He even called the male figure a debauched edition of me, suggesting a certain self-awareness, perhaps even a bit of self-loathing. He was struggling to reconcile his public image with his artistic aspirations, and in Gatsby, we see that same struggle play out in the aftermath of Myrtle's death. Nick finds Gatsby standing vigil outside the Buchanan's house, waiting for Wolfsheim's thugs to arrive. Host,